This concludes our graduate presentations for the day. Please give a warm round of virtual applause to Kimio, Ifani, Alex, Zachary, and Elisabetta for their excellent work. As aforementioned, our Q&A panel will now immediately commence. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat box where I will relay it to the panelists. Alternatively, you are welcome to directly ask your question to our panelists by clicking the raise hand button. And once your hand is raised, you will be prompted to temporarily unmute yourself. Yes, Professor Krohn.
Well, those were all incredibly fascinating. So thank you all for those presentations. I just had a question for Camille about the watermelon. And I was at a conference in Cambridge, England, right before the pandemic that was all about the pineapple. And there were a couple of people who were talking about the pineapple in a similarly sort of cultural, historical, imagistic way, in the way that the pineapple kind of featured in all kinds of discourses that were, you know, definitely racial, if not racist, and not only in the United States, but in a lot of other countries. And I'm wondering whether you've thought about the pineapple at all and whether that might be a really interesting comparison. I don't know like what you're doing with this project and where it fits into your larger work, but it might be really interesting to look at other fruits.
Yeah, I definitely think it would be. I hadn't thought about the pineapple, so I'll definitely have to look into that in the future because that sounds really interesting. But definitely at the very least, I have seen the watermelon. You know, it's not only a big thing in the United States, like in the UK, for example, you see the watermelon a lot, and especially in reference to Black people, you know, in America, but also people of African descent who are from Africa, and then Caribbeans as well. But I think, yeah, definitely the pineapple, I would have to look into a little more because that sounds very, like, there's a lot of meat there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to talk for too long, but I think especially one aspect that you talked about it somewhat, that sort of agricultural history of it, but with pineapples, there's a whole kind of corporate side of it, which has to do with a lot of colonial exploitation and the different places where pineapples are cultivated and the whole process. And you were looking at a particular moment in time, but I think there's like a lot of other stuff you could bring into the project that would be incredibly interesting. So
yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. That sounds really great.
All right, we do have a question for Kimio again from an anonymous attendee. They ask, I understand many of your examples with your presentation were based on print and painting material. Do you see your work, including Cheryl Dunye, I apologize if I mispronounced that, film The Watermelon Woman, or is that too far removed time-wise?
Yeah, so most of the images that I was looking at were actually print and photography, except for the Charles Ethan Porter at the end. That one was painting. But in the Digital Humanities project that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, that this work could actually stem from, I actually do talk about Cheryl Dunye's The Watermelon Woman because I love it. I think it's great. I mean, it's easily just one of my favorite movies, and particularly the way that it portrays Black queer friendships. I think that it's definitely important to this conversation. So yes, I am thinking about The Watermelon Woman.
Great, thank you, Kimio. So I have another question for Alex from Professor Bronwyn Wilson. She says, listening to your interesting paper, I was wondering why pincers are used for both Apollonia, which makes sense for teeth, and Agatha, which is less clear. Since pincers are part of the Arma Christi for removing the nails, could you please say something about how that might contribute to the Eucharistic argument? Agatha's breasts are often displayed on a paten, at least a bit later, which fits, but curious about the pincers.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked about that actually, because there was so much I tried to squeeze into this very short presentation, but the pincers definitely would be a similar comparison because there are all these different elements and metaphors for the Eucharist are kind of piled on top of each other. But what's interesting actually about a lot of depictions of Agatha's martyrdom is there is no shortage of creative ways that people have come up with to depict removing her breasts. The pincher's become the kind of most popular and kind of accepted one that shows up in a lot of prints and paintings that we're both familiar with. But earlier illuminations, there's scissors that are used, there's ropes pulling at them at different angles, there's a claw that's kind of used in a fair amount of images as well. And I'm hoping to, at some point in a future kind of point with this project, look into more sort of surgical instruments and the way that that's used in kind of medical texts, and look at the way her instruments are depicted versus that. So that's something that I definitely will also want to include in the project. But the pinchers is definitely, I think, a connection to the Arma Christi. Yeah.
Professor Wilson says, thank you. I have a question for Ifani from an anonymous attendee. Ifani, how would your artist's work look outside the white cube? Would being in an exterior do anything, or am I just taking this too literally?
Thanks for this question. I think it could definitely be installed outside of the white cube. I think it would be really interesting to experiment with finding alternative spaces, whether it's kind of private home spaces, and just really pushing the central vision of the work, which is to think about eating, sharing space, gathering, communal experience, and also, the spiritual dimensions of the work, thinking about ritual. So I think those ideas kind of lend themselves to a range of spaces. And I think given that the work is trying to kind of challenge these Western notions, I think challenging the space of the white cube as the only space or the most appropriate space for the work is really in line with what the artist is trying to do. And, perhaps even, I don't know if this is what you meant by exterior, but perhaps even, outdoor installations could be generative. I'm thinking of, roadside eating in different parts of Nigeria, and how, this work could be presented in a way that kind of replicates that experience and what that could add to it. So yeah, I think there's lots of possibilities, and I'm really hoping with this paper to kind of encourage, thinking about like what more this could be done with this work. Yeah, so thank you for that.
I have a question for Zachary, and it is, would Fukuoka Masanobu's methods work anywhere and everywhere? Would it be possible to undo so much damage already done onto United States agriculture? Is it restorative?
Yeah, that's a great question. And he would say that yes, it could be done anywhere. And his personal circumstances were in Japan and with rice farming. But later in life, he actually participated in the anti-desertification environmental movement and participated in greening. And he invented the clay balls, which have become like the popular seed bomb. So absolutely within his framework, he would say yes.
Thank you so much. And I have a question that is posed for all of the speakers today, which is food is not a typical topic for art historians, but each of our speakers has shown what a rich, fascinating, and important topic it is and how it expands and challenges our disciplines. Can each of the speakers talk a bit about how they see their work in terms of its disciplinary influences? And you're welcome to jump in whenever you'd like.
I can jump in. I'll go first since I'm the only medievalist going today, do the early stuff first. So this is going to be one chapter of my dissertation project and kind of one element of that. And I am hoping that there's been a lot of really amazing scholarship that's kind of done on medieval mysticism and food piety, but Agatha's and sort of the way that gender is constructed during that period is well, Agatha's been left out of the conversation too, how gender and sort of the feminine gender at that period has been constructed to think about sort of generativeness and productivity and kind of life providing both spiritual sustenance and physically. So I really do hope to kind of build on that and add to it. And for the larger project, I'm considering mainly public objects that are in kind of shared spaces and church spaces, altarpieces, prints that are circulating, seen by wider varieties of people, so that hopefully we can get a sense of kind of a more generalized and not just kind of luxury top-down approach to some of these images. So I hope that thinking about how kind of important food and eating was like in our lives always, and then at that period as well, that it will kind of tell us more about maybe what the normal person might have thought of these kind of theological debates that are happening. It's a bit rambling, but I figured I'd start us off.
Not at all, thank you. Would the rest of the presenters like to chime in?
Yeah, I can also say something. So looking at Lucy Beach's work is also part of one of the chapters of my thesis. And I think her practice is really interesting. It's extremely based on research and on a really wide variety of sources. So I was mentioning this pyramid investment community, which is something I never thought I would look into as an art historian. And her sources for her work also come a lot from like anthropology and sociology, and video art in itself has a strong tie also to media culture. So I feel like this fluidity of disciplines is becoming more and more necessary when looking at contemporary art, especially contemporary art that has a kind of socio-political engagement. So definitely looking at this artist's work, I think, has expanded my sort of understanding of what other disciplines are influencing art historical practice, and how important it is to also draw from this interdisciplinary approach in our own methodology as researchers in this field.
Thank you, Elisabetta. Anyone else?
Sure, I can jump in. So I also work on art. I work on ecological art and contemporary art. And so I'm interested in eco-criticism, environmental humanities, and the history of environmentalism and ecology, and also recent trends to think beyond the human or work on decentering the human or theorizing post-humanism. My interest in these subjects led me to permaculture, and trying to think about permaculture as a creative practice. And so this was kind of like an experiment in that, since Fukuoka is foundational to a number of different permaculture guide book writers, I guess. But one of the difficulties is that there is very limited visual material. So how to approach, some of these writings and some of these guidebooks from a visual perspective or an aesthetic perspective is one of my questions.
Thank you. And if anyone else wants to answer that question, please go ahead. But I do have two other anonymous questions that are posed to Ifani. So first, does Sarawiwa ever have a hand in her installs? / have you spoken to her? And what does it mean to shift the labor responsibility to curators?
Yeah, so I still need to interview Zina Sarawiwa. I'm still early in the process of thinking about her work. So that is next up in terms of my engagement with Table Manners. So I don't know how involved she is in her installation. I think drawing on my own kind of experience with exhibitions, working on exhibitions, usually a curator and artist work quite closely to design the installation of a work. And of course, different artists might want to have a more hands-on approach to the installation. But the brunt of the responsibility for the labor for executing a curatorial project, an exhibition, and installation does fall on the curator. And so I think that the kinds of questions I'm asking from a curator's perspective about her work are kind of typical of the questions that curators would ask during this kind of process. And I'm trying to remember the rest of this question.
I can refresh your memory.
Yeah.
So one, does Sarwiwa ever have a hand in her installations? Have you spoken to her? And what does it mean to shift the labor responsibility to curators?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so hopefully that answers the question. I would love to, hear more about, I would love to hear more in case there's something there's a part I'm not answering, but yeah, I think that from what I know of Zina Sarwiwa's practice, she really clearly, and this is really striking for an artist, in my opinion, she really communicates clearly these very particular and often kind of mystical elements to her artworks. And so I think she seems to have a really clear vision, a really kind of precise way that she wants her work to be installed and to be engaged with. And so my hope is that in the future, perhaps with the help of my work, curators kind of allow her vision for the exhibition of her work to affect their ways of presenting the work in the White Cube and potentially outside of the White Cube even more deeply.
Great, thank you so much for your answer. And I think we have time for one last question, and this one is also an anonymous question for Alex, which is, it asks how materiality influences your research since you reference Bynum, and if you can speak more about that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Again, given the time, I didn't get into it, but wood, for example, is written about by ancient and medieval sort of theorists that it was this living material that could kind of expand and contract. And parchment was described often as Christ's flesh that was sort of pierced by the act of writing and illuminating. And red rubrication, of course, not only signifying an important text, but can also be often thought of as like the blood that's on the parchment. And so these kind of collapsing of materiality and metaphors definitely absolutely plays into it. And I think especially because the sculptures I mentioned at the beginning are these kind of carved wooden objects. They come from a tree that was grown, that was living, that potentially, lime would not produce fruit necessarily, but it has that, again, generative power. And you can think about, and medieval theorists also wrote about this, where the cross was obviously a living tree, often sometimes depicted really as a living tree, right? And so that really, again, emphasizes this idea that these objects are always kind of alive and changing. So materiality is definitely a really great point to bring out for this, yeah.
Thank you so much, Alex. So this concludes our Q&A session for day one of Edible Undercurrents. Once again, thank you very much to our panelists and to our audience members for the lively discussion. Should you have any more questions for Kimio, Ifani, Alex, Zachary, and Elisabetta, please direct them to the symposium email, edibleundercurrentssymposium@gmail.com. I will include that in the chat, and we will forward them to our speakers. And before I turn over the virtual podium to my fellow cohort mate, Drew Lash, who will be introducing this evening's keynote speaker, we will be taking a brief break, and we will be reconvening at 5:50 p.m. See you then.